I never thought I would be standing on a sidewalk at 67 years old with 2 suitcases at my feet, watching my own daughter turn the deadbolt on the house I had paid for with 40 years of my own 2 hands. But life has a way of showing you the truth at the worst possible hour of the worst possible morning. And on that gray Tuesday in Harwick Cove, with the fog rolling in off the water and the smell of salt hanging thick in the air, the truth came for me all at once, tucked inside a plain white envelope that would have changed everything if I had let it. Before I go back to the beginning, tell me where you are watching from today. And if this story stays with you, stay with me to the end, because what my daughter did next is not the part that broke my heart. The part that broke my heart came later, and I never saw it coming. The morning had started like any other. Harwick Cove is a small coastal town, all weathered clapboard and stubborn old houses that lean into the wind, and my house on Lantern Row was one of the oldest of them. A tall Victorian with stained glass over the door and wood floors that groaned like an old ship when you walked across them. I had raised my daughter Sabrina in that house after her father Walter passed when she was only 4 years old, and I was suddenly a widow with a child, a mortgage, and a trade that most people did not think of as a trade at all. I make quilts. Not the folded kind you buy in a store, but story quilts, the kind that take a season of my life to finish. I stitch the history of this coast into cloth. Fishing boats and lighthouses. The great storm of my grandmother's time. The faces of women who worked the canneries with their hands cracked from the cold. For most of my life, people in town smiled at my quilts the way you smile at a child's drawing. Sweet, they would say. Isn't that a nice hobby? It took me a long time to stop letting that word hobby make me feel small. That morning, an envelope waited on the mat by the front door, slipped through the brass slot while the fog was still low on the street. The return address read Sims and Associates Attorneys at Law. My hands were already unsteady before I opened it, because I recognized the name of the client written below the firm. Eugenia Hartwell. Eugenia was a woman almost nobody in Harwick Cove had actually met. She lived alone in a great stone house out on the cliffs, and for the last 15 years of her life, she had let exactly one person through her door, and that person was me. I had knocked the first time only to ask if she would let a group of school children see her garden. She said no to the children, and yes to me, and something odd and quiet grew between us after that. I brought her quilts to look at. She brought out tea and told me stories about a coast that no longer existed. She had no family that she ever spoke of. When she died in the spring, I went to the small service, and there were 6 people there, and I cried more than any of them. The letter said that Eugenia Hartwell had named me the sole beneficiary of her estate. It said the estate included her stone house on the cliffs and financial assets that once the process was complete would come to somewhere near $9 million. I read it 3 times standing in my own front hall. $9 million. I did not feel joy. I felt the floor tilt under me the way it does when a wave you did not see comes up under the boat. The letter was careful and plain. It explained that an estate of this size does not simply appear in your bank account. It has to pass through probate, the long court process that settles a person's affairs, and that could take many months. In the meantime, as the named heir, I would be able to receive a modest advance to cover immediate needs, but the bulk of it would sit locked behind the court and the lawyers for a good long while. I folded the letter and slid it into the pocket of my cardigan close against my heart, and I made a decision in that first minute that I would keep the whole thing to myself. My daughter and her husband had moved back into my house 6 months earlier after Preston's business collapsed, claiming they only needed a little time to find their feet again. I had said yes without a second thought, because that is what mothers do. But over those 6 months, I had watched my own home close in around me, one room at a time. My sewing room, the bright back parlor where I had worked for 30 years, became Preston's office. My frame folded away against the wall to make space for his desk and his monitors. My kitchen was rearranged so many times to suit their preferences that I could no longer find my own cinnamon in the dark. My garden shrank to make room for a patio where they liked to entertain. Bit by bit, I had learned to take up less space to move quietly, to hold my cards close in a house that had once been entirely my own. I did not fully understand yet why I wanted to hide something so wonderful as that letter. I only knew that when you have spent half a year being made smaller, you learn not to hand people anything they can use. I had barely gotten my coat on to walk into town when Sabrina intercepted me at the foot of the stairs. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a hasty knot, and her face had the tight rehearsed look of a woman who had practiced a speech in the mirror. "Mom," she said, "we need to talk. Sit down." Preston came out of the kitchen with a coffee cup in his hand, and that smile of his, the one that stopped at his mouth and never reached his eyes. "Judith," he said, using my first name, the way he always did, as if I were a business acquaintance rather than the woman whose roof he slept under. "We have been thinking about the living situation, and it is time for some honest conversation." I did not sit down. I stood by the newel post with my purse against my chest, and something inside it seemed to burn the letter folded there. Sabrina drew a breath. "Mom, Preston and I have decided it would be best if we took over the house. All of it. We want to raise our family here, and this place has so much potential, but 3 generations under one roof is complicated, and well, you have been struggling." "Struggling," I said. "The stairs are getting hard for you," she went on, though I had never once complained about the stairs. "The taxes are more than your quilt money can cover. You left the stove on twice last month. We have already spoken with Cedar Haven, the assisted living community out past the marina. They have a lovely opening in their care wing, but they can only hold it until tomorrow afternoon. The movers are booked for the morning." I felt the blood leave my face. "Tomorrow," I said. "You booked movers for tomorrow. You want me to pack up 40 years of my life in a single day and move into a care wing, and you decided all of this without a word to me." "We hired people to help you pack," Preston said, as though that were kindness. "Judith, be reasonable. This house is too much for you. Everyone can see it." "Everyone," I repeated, and that word landed hard because I understood in that moment that they had been talking. Not to me about me. And right on the beat, as if she had been waiting on the porch for her cue. The doorbell rang, and Sabrina opened it to a woman I knew by reputation, Camille Ashworth, who sat on the board of the private academy where Sabrina worked, and who had never once in 20 years spoken a full sentence to me. Camille came in on a cloud of expensive perfume and gave me a look so soft and so pitying that it made my skin crawl. "Judith," she said, taking both my hands in hers. "How brave you are. Sabrina told me about the difficult decision you have come to. It takes real courage to admit when it is time to let others take care of you." I looked at my daughter. "What exactly did you tell her, Sabrina?" "That you finally admitted the house had become too much," Camille said gently before Sabrina could answer, as if she were speaking to a frightened animal. "That it was your own idea to move somewhere safer." That was the moment the floor stopped tilting and went cold and hard under me instead. They were not simply trying to move me out. They were writing the story of it, telling the whole town that a confused old woman had asked to be put away, so that when I resisted my resistance, itself would look like proof of the very confusion they were describing. It was a beautiful little trap, and I had walked right into the middle of it in my own front hall. "I never said any such thing," I told Camille, keeping my voice as level as I could. But I could see it did not matter what I said. The 3 of them were already looking at me the way you look at a stubborn patient. So I did the only thing that would not confirm their story. I stayed calm. I said I needed some air to think, and I picked up my purse and I walked out the door and down Lantern Row into the fog, and I did not let them see my hands shaking until I had turned the corner. I want to tell you that I marched straight to a lawyer with a plan. I did not. I walked all the way down to the harbor and stood at the seawall for a long time watching the fishing boats loom in and out of the mist before my head cleared enough to think. Then I did 2 things. First, I went to the office of Harold Sims, the lawyer whose name was on the letter, a tidy older man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and I signed the papers that formally accepted my place as Eugenia's heir. He was kind and unhurried. He walked me through what probate meant again patiently, and he confirmed what the letter had said. The money in the house would come to me, but not quickly. These things move at the speed of the court. There would be an advance to keep me steady in the meantime, a sum in the low tens of thousands, and I should think of everything else as promised, but not yet in hand. Then, on his recommendation, I walked 2 blocks to the office of Nora Whitlock, an attorney who handled family matters. A sharp woman about 10 years younger than me, with a gray suit and a level gaze that I trusted immediately. I told her all of it. The inheritance, the 6 months, the movers booked for the morning, the story they were spreading around town. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she set down her pen and chose her words with care. "Judith," she said, "I do not usually tell people to keep financial news from their own children. But you have just described a daughter and a son-in-law who tried to have you declared unfit and moved into a care facility the moment you stopped being useful to them financially. Until we understand what they are after, you tell them nothing about this estate. Do you understand me?" "Nothing." She was blunt about the timing too, which I appreciated. "The inheritance is real," she said, "but it is months away. Whatever we do it on the strength of your advance and your own savings, not on money you do not have yet. And there is one more thing." She tapped the folder. "You mentioned your son-in-law's business failed. Has he had access to anything of yours? Bank statements, the deed, your signature on anything?" I thought of the strange envelope I had seen that morning on the kitchen table. A bank envelope with a lender's name. I did not recognize that Preston had swept into a drawer the moment I looked at it. I told her about it. She wrote it down and underlined it twice, and I did not understand yet why. "Understand something," Judith, she said, folding her hands on the desk. "People who plan a move like the one you have described, movers booked a care facility deposit, paid a story already spread through town, do not decide all of that on a Tuesday morning. This has been in the works for weeks," which means they were confident. Confident people usually have a reason to be. So while they think they are managing you, we are going to quietly find out what that reason is. You keep going to your appointments. You keep your head up in public. You do not let them see one crack, because a crack is exactly what they are hoping to photograph. Can you do that? I looked at this woman I had known for less than an hour, and I felt something settle in me that I had not felt in months, the feeling of no longer being alone against them. I raised 8 quilts to national collections while doing my own bookkeeping at midnight and raising a girl by myself, I told her. I think I can manage keeping my chin up. Nora almost smiled. "Good," she said. "Then we are going to be fine." By the time I walked home, it was past dark, and the fog had thickened into a proper haze that haloed every street lamp. When I came through my own front door, I found 3 strangers in my living room. A young woman with a portfolio, 2 men with tablets and measuring tapes, all of them photographing my furniture and making notes, and Preston standing among them with his arms folded like the lord of the manor. "Who are these people?" I said from the doorway. "The design team from a firm in the city," Sabrina said, coming in from the hall. "They are pricing the renovation. Mom, the decision is made. The deposit at Cedar Haven is paid." I looked at the young woman with the portfolio, who at least had the grace to look uncomfortable. Then I looked at my daughter and at Preston and at the strangers holding up my grandmother's chair and turning it over to read the maker's mark, and something in me that had been folding itself smaller and smaller for 6 months simply stopped folding. "Get out," I said. The room went still. The young designer murmured something about coming back another time. "I am not talking to you," I told her gently. I turned to Sabrina and Preston. "I am talking to the 2 of you. This is my house. My name is on the deed. I paid for it with quilts that this whole town called a hobby, and I raised my daughter in it alone, and I am not leaving it. Get these people out of my home." Preston laughed, but it was strained. "You are being hysterical, Judith, and you are behaving like a thief in a house that is not yours," I said. "I want you both out. We will discuss how and when with lawyers. But those people leave tonight." Sabrina's face went from shock to something ugly and unfamiliar. "Fine," she hissed, "if that is how you want it. But do not come crying to us when the roof leaks and your little quilt money will not cover it. Do not expect us to save you." "I will manage," I said. Preston stepped close to me then and dropped his voice so the designers would not hear, and there was a threat in it that made the hair rise on my arms. "You have no idea what you are doing," he said. "You will find that life gets very uncomfortable if you insist on this. This is not over, Judith." No, I agreed, and I was surprised by how steady I sounded because inside I was shaking like the last leaf on a tree. "It is not over. It is only just beginning." That night I lay awake in my own bed listening to them move around downstairs, and I held the folded letter against my chest like a child holds a stone that has become lucky simply by being kept. I did not yet know how much I would need to be brave. I only knew that the woman who had walked out the front door that morning and the woman lying in the dark now were not quite the same person, and that whoever I was becoming, she was not going to be put away. Morning came without incident, but Nora had been right to warn me that a shared house is a dangerous place during a fight, and by the second day I understood that I could not stay under the same roof with people who had tried to remove me from it. So I did something I had never done in my life. I packed 2 suitcases with the things I could not bear to lose: my mother's thimble, a bundle of photographs, the small folding sewing kit I had carried since I was a girl, and I called Nora, who told me plainly that leaving for a while was the wiser course, and that I should keep every valuable and irreplaceable thing with me. I was closing the second suitcase when Sabrina appeared in my bedroom doorway. For a moment, the hard mask slipped, and she looked almost like the child I had raised, uncertain and a little afraid. "You are leaving," she said. "For now," I answered. "So after all that you are just giving up?" I looked at her, and I made myself remember that this was the girl I had once carried on my hip through the tide pools, teaching her the names of the small creatures in the rocks. I am not giving up anything I said. I am removing myself from a situation that has turned poison on the advice of my attorney. Her eyes narrowed at the word attorney, and the softness closed over again like water. You lawyered up against your own mother, she said, twisting it, and I did not bother to correct the direction of it. I lifted my suitcases and I walked past her, and she stepped aside to let me go, and I did not look back at the room where I had slept for 40 years. Preston was on the phone in the hall as I came down, his voice tight and clipped, and he fell silent when he saw the suitcases. Running away, he said. A tactical retreat, I said. Very different thing. And I walked out into the salt air of the morning, and a car from a service Nora had arranged was already waiting at the curb, and I got into it and let it carry me away from Lantern Row. The Marlowe was the finest hotel in Harwick Cove, an old harborfront building with marble floors and a chandelier in the lobby, and I felt as out of place in it as a gull in a ballroom. A polite young woman at the desk asked how she could help me, and I heard myself ask for a room with a view of the water, and I slid the plain debit card from my advance across the counter, and I signed for a suite that cost more per night than I had ever spent on a coat. I want to be honest with you here. I could afford it, but only because of that advance and the small nest egg I had scraped together over the years. The great inheritance was still locked away behind the court months from my hands, and I never once let myself forget that. I was not a rich woman yet. I was a careful woman who had suddenly been handed the beginning of a door. The room took my breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the harbor, and the point where the North Beacon lighthouse stood against the gray, sweeping its slow light across the water. I sat on the edge of the enormous bed, and I thought absurdly that just 2 days before I had been lying awake worrying about property taxes, and now I was here, and neither of those facts felt real. The next morning I met with the man Harold Sims had recommended to help me plan a financial advisor named Theodore Grange, an old-fashioned sort with a quiet manner and an office that looked out over the commercial docks. He did not talk to me the way people usually talk to older women about money, slowly and loudly as if I might not follow. He talked to me like a colleague. He walked me through what would happen when probate finished, how the estate would be structured, how I might protect it and let it grow, and how above all I should not spend against it before it arrived. Most people who come into money late, he told me, make their worst mistakes in the first year. They buy the fast car, the boat that sits at the dock, the timeshare in a place they visit once. They chase bigger returns and lose the whole thing to a stranger with a good smile. You strike me as someone who will be the exception. But do allow yourself a little joy along the way, Judith. There is a balance between good sense and living, and I have watched too many careful people find the money only after they had lost the years in which they might have enjoyed it. I told him I had lived frugally my whole adult life and did not expect that to change overnight. That is good, he said, but I want you to hear me on the joy as well as the caution. And then he said something that stayed with me. Money late in life is not really about the money. It is about permission. Most of my clients your age spent 40 years asking whether they were allowed to want things. The work now is learning to stop asking. I did not know it yet, but that single sentence would turn out to describe the whole of what happened to me that season better than any lawyer's letter ever could. I left his office with a plan and a strange new feeling under my ribs, something between fear and possibility. And it was on my way back to the hotel, walking to clear my head, that I passed the tall windows of Bellamy Auction House, the finest such place on this stretch of coast, and saw a printed sign in the glass. Textiles and Maritime Heritage, Saturday. On an impulse I did not examine, I pushed open the door and went in. Inside it was hushed, an elegant soft light falling on glass cases and framed things on the walls. A woman with silver streaked in her dark hair came toward me in a beautifully cut suit and introduced herself as Frances Bellamy. I told her I was only looking, and she handed me a glossy catalog, and I turned the pages idly until one item stopped my hand cold. A set of 19th century coastal survey charts, hand-drawn with tiny careful notes in the margins about the plants and the birds along the shore. And beside them, in the same lot, 3 antique quilts appliqued with ships and lighthouses stitched by the women of a whaling family more than a century ago. They are quite special, Frances Bellamy said, watching my face. Are you a collector, miss? Merrick, I said. Judith Merrick. And no, not yet, but I might become one. Her eyes changed. Merrick, she repeated. The quilt artist. You made the harbor cycle that hung at the library. I stood in front of it for an hour. Warmth spread through my chest at being known for my work in that room by that woman. "Coming to our preview on Friday evening," she said. "It is by invitation, but I would be delighted to add your name. Come and see these up close before Saturday." I left with her card in my hand and a small, unfamiliar thrill running through me, the feeling of a door I had assumed was locked, swinging open at my touch. But the thing that changed me most in those first days did not happen at the auction house. It happened in the cold stone rooms of Eugenia Hartwell's cliffside house, which Harold Sims had given me the keys to so that I could begin the slow work of taking inventory for the estate. I went out there alone on a bright, windy afternoon, and I let myself in, and I walked through rooms full of a lifetime I had only ever glimpsed at the edges. And in a long room off the back behind a plain door, I found the thing that undid me. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with quilts. My quilts. Every major piece I had made and sold over the last 20 years, the ones I had let go of one at a time to a string of anonymous buyers through a dealer in the city, buyers I had never met and had assumed were strangers scattered across the country. They were all here, every one hung with care, lit softly, labeled in Eugenia's own small hand with the year and the story each one told. She had bought them all. For 2 decades, the one person in the world who had come to matter to me had been quietly, secretly collecting the work that the rest of my life had told me was only a hobby, and she had never said a word because she knew I understood now that I would not have been able to bear the kindness of it while she was alive. In the corner nearest the window hung the first quilt I had ever sold, the one I had let go of 20 years before to pay for the new roof after the winter the old one failed. I had grieved that piece for years, telling myself it had gone into some rich stranger who would keep it folded in a closet and never look at it. And here it was in the best light in the room, with a small card beneath it in Eugenia's hand that read in her spidery writing, "The Marsh at Dawn, Merrick, the year I first understood her." I remembered the afternoons in her stone kitchen, the two of us with our tea, and how she would ask me about a quilt I had just finished with a strange hunger in her questions, wanting to know every choice I had made, the color of a thread, why a boat leaned the way it did. I had thought she was only being kind to a lonely woman. She had been studying the work of an artist she believed in and could not say so aloud. I sat down on the cold floor in the middle of that room, and I wept until I had nothing left. Not from grief, though there was grief in it. I wept because for 40 years a small hard voice inside me had said that my work did not matter, that I had wasted my one talent on scraps of cloth. And here in this silent room was the proof, hung and lit and loved, that at least one person had known better all along. Eugenia had left me a fortune, and I understood now that the money was the smallest part of what she had given me. The true gift was in this room. She had spent the last quiet years of her life gathering up the scattered evidence of my worth and keeping it safe so that when she was gone and I was at my lowest, I would walk in here and finally see it. I walked out of that house a different woman than the one who had walked in. Not richer. The money was still months away, and it was never the point. I walked out knowing for the first time in my life, all the way down to the floor of myself, that I was an artist and always had been. Tell me before I go on, has there ever been a person in your life who saw the real you when you could not see yourself? Hold on to that thought, because it matters for what comes next. That week I let Frances Bellamy's world take me in a little. On her advice, I visited a boutique on the harbor run by a tall, sharp-eyed woman named Vivienne, who looked me over once and said I had lovely bones and beautiful coloring, and that we were going to stop hiding both. She did not try to make me look younger. She tried to make me look like myself, only unafraid. I walked out with a deep teal dress that caught the light and a few other things, and I signed the receipt without flinching, and I told myself and Theodore Grange in my head that a woman was allowed a little joy. And it was as I came back to the Marlowe with the boxes in my arms that I saw it. Parked across the street, half in the shadow of a delivery van, was Preston's black sedan, and Preston behind the wheel, watching the front doors of the hotel. So they had found me. Harwick Cove is not a large town, and the Marlowe is the obvious place for a woman with a little money to stay. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, waiting to feel afraid, and instead I felt something clean and hot rise in me that I can only call defiance. Let him watch, I thought. Let him wonder. I walked through the lobby with my chin up and my boxes in my arms, and I did not once look back at the street. The days ran together after that, and I want to be careful with the time because it did not all happen in a rush, the way it can seem when you tell it. Weeks passed. The probate ground forward at its own slow pace. The legal matter of my house and of getting Sabrina and Preston to leave it moved forward too, on Nora's careful schedule, in the way such things actually move, with notices and filings and dates on a calendar rather than shouting matches. And through those same weeks, a second life began to open up for me, one stitch at a time. It began at the Harwick Maritime Museum, where the survey charts from Eugenia's estate and the antique whaling quilts turned out to be of real interest. I met the curator, a careful, earnest man named Dr. Owen Traver, and then the museum's director, Dr. Patricia Lund, a woman about my own age with a handshake like a captain's. They had a proposal, and it left me speechless. They wanted to build an exhibition that would place the antique maritime quilts from Eugenia's collection, which would soon be legally mine, alongside new story quilts made by me, so that a visitor could walk from the century-old cloth to the living work and see how the women of this coast had told their lives in thread across 200 years. Dr. Lund said the museum wished to commission the new work formally and named a figure of $85,000 for the series. It was more than I had earned from my art in the previous 5 years combined, and though the coming inheritance meant I did not need it, the commission itself, the being asked, the being valued, meant more to me than the money ever could. A professor from Ashfield University, Lydia Kerr, wanted to build a course around the exhibition and asked whether I might one day speak to her students. I said yes to all of it, and I felt for the first time in decades like a woman with a future instead of only a past. In the days after I began the real work, which no amount of money could do for me, I walked the shore below the point at first light with a small notebook the way I had as a young woman, sketching the way the fog sat on the water and the exact rust color the old hulls turned after a season in the salt. Dr. Traver arranged for me to spend an afternoon in the museum's back rooms with the antique whaling quilts laid out on long tables, and I bent over them for hours with a magnifier, reading the tiny stitches of women dead 100 years, learning their hands the way you learn a voice. There was a young marine historian there who kept me company, and she told me that photographs could record the coast, but only the quilts seemed to remember it. And I wrote that down too, because it was the truest thing anyone had said to me about my trade in 40 years. I went home to the hotel each evening, tired in the good way, the way I had almost forgotten, the tiredness that comes from making something rather than from surviving someone. But my daughter and her husband were not finished, and their next move was the cruelest yet. It came as a letter hand delivered to the hotel from a Dr. Gerald Nash, a physician I had never met, and never once sat across from, expressing his professional concern about my recent, in his careful phrase, behavioral changes and unusual spending based on information provided by concerned members of my family. The letter suggested I submit myself for evaluation at my earliest convenience. I recognized the name. Nash was a friend of Camille Ashworth's husband, and both of them sat on the board of Sabrina's Academy. This was not medicine. This was the next stage of the same trap that had been laid in my front hall, the story of the confused old woman now being written in a doctor's hand. I took the letter to Nora, and she read it with a tightening jaw. "This borders on malpractice," she said. "He has never examined you. He is making insinuations about your mind based entirely on what interested parties have told him." And I understood then what they were reaching for. If they could get a doctor on record with concerns about my capacity, they could go to a court and ask to be made my guardians, to be given control over my decisions and my money, and to freeze everything until the court sorted it out. "Can they win that?" I asked her. "Almost certainly not," Nora said. "Guardianship is not a letter from a doctor who has never met you. It is a formal court proceeding with a real evaluation by a neutral examiner and a judge who will look very hard at who is asking and why. You have your own attorney. You have made a string of sound documented decisions. You have a financial advisor and a museum commission and a clear head. A campaign of whispers is not evidence." But she added, and here she leaned forward, "Whispers can still do damage if we let them go unanswered. The best defense is not silence. It is daylight. Let the whole town see exactly how competent you are." So that is what we did. When a reporter from the Harwick Courier named Delia Frost asked to interview me about the museum exhibition, I said yes, and I used it to tell my own story in my own words before Sabrina and Camille could finish telling theirs. We met in a quiet room at the Marlowe, and her questions were thoughtful about my 40 years of work, about Eugenia's collection, about what it meant to answer a century of anonymous women's stitching with new work of my own. Near the end, she set her pen down and asked gently whether it was true that there were tensions in my family about my recent choices. I had known the question would come, and I had decided how to meet it. "Families change shape when circumstances change suddenly," I told her. My focus now is on building a home where I can do my work and on giving something to this town that will outlast me. That is where my attention is. She asked me one last thing, whether I had any word for people who find an unexpected door opening late in their lives. I thought about it for a while before I answered. I would tell them, it is never too late to go back for the part of yourself you set down years ago to carry someone else, I said. Taking care of yourself is not selfishness. You cannot give from a lamp that has gone dark. When the story ran on the front page beneath a photograph of me laughing with Dr. Traver over the exhibition plans, it did more to protect me than any letter my lawyer could have written. You cannot easily convince a town that a woman is losing her mind when they have just read her speaking so clearly about it. And Frances Bellamy, when she heard what my family was attempting, offered, without my asking, to host a small reception at the auction house to announce the museum partnership, an evening of Harwick Cove's cultural world. Exactly the sort of room in which a woman does not look confused or fragile, but poised, respected, and entirely herself. The reception was set for a Thursday evening a few weeks into all of this, and I dressed for it with more care than I had taken in years in Vivian's teal dress with a single string of pearls. And I looked at the woman in the mirror and hardly knew her, not because she looked so different, but because she stood up straight and looked back at me without apology. When the car came, I crossed the lobby of the Marlowe with my head high, and I saw Preston near the front desk, deep in conversation with the manager. And he froze when he saw me and nudged the man he was with, and I did not falter in my step. I walked out into the warm evening past the scent of jasmine from the hotel garden and got into the car and left him standing there. Bellamy Auction House glowed that night, transformed from its usual severe elegance into something warm and welcoming, glass cases lit softly, and along one wall framed prints of my own quilts, creating a bridge from the past to the present that the exhibition would explore. Frances met me at the door in a black gown and told me the guests were arriving, and Dr. Traver was eager to make the announcement. Inside, perhaps 50 people were already gathered, museum patrons and collectors, and a few faces from the university. And to my astonishment, many of them knew my name and spoke of my work with real feeling. An old gentleman told me that a quilt of mine had changed the way he saw the harbor he had walked past his whole life. A young photographer told me that no camera had ever captured the marsh the way my needle had. Every word settled into me like ballast steadying a ship that had spent 40 years listing to one side. Dr. Lund brought over the museum's board chair and a professor of textile history, and we were deep in a warm discussion of the exhibition's design when a ripple of unease moved through the room, and I looked up to see 3 people standing in the doorway. Sabrina and Preston and Camille Ashworth between them, dressed formally and looking as out of place among the easy warmth of that crowd as a cold draft under a door. They had not been invited. Sabrina's eyes found me across the room, and her mouth actually fell open, because whatever she had expected to find, it was not her mother in teal silk surrounded by people who respected her. Frances appeared at my elbow. "Uninvited," she murmured. "Shall I have them shown out?" I thought about it. Then I straightened my shoulders. "No," I said. "Let them stay. But keep someone near. I wanted them to see it. I wanted them to stand in that room and watch the woman they had tried to erase be celebrated by people whose respect they could not buy." They came toward me through the crowd, Camille wearing her soft, pitying smile like a mask. "Mother," Sabrina said, pitching her voice to carry, "what a surprise to find you here." "Is it?" I said, taking a small sip of champagne. "I imagine that is exactly why you came." Camille slid into this conversation with the ease of a woman who had spent her life managing rooms. "Judith, dear, no one has seen you since you left home so suddenly. Sabrina has been worried sick." The lie was so smooth I nearly admired it. "Has she?" I said. "How strange, then, that neither of you has called once to ask how I am." Dr. Lund, standing beside me, said pleasantly to Sabrina, "You must be very proud of your mother. Her work has documented this region's living history for decades." Sabrina's smile thinned. "Of course," she said, "though this sudden return to public life has surprised us all. Mother has been rather," she paused, "delicately unpredictable lately." "On the contrary," Dr. Traver said, stepping in with the mild firmness of a man who had heard where this was going, "Miss Merrick has shown remarkable clarity and vision for this project. We have wanted her involved for years." That was a generous stretch of the truth, and I loved him for it. I watched Camille's eyes move around the room, counting who was listening, and I saw her decide to change the weather. "The stress of all this new attention," she said, "all this scrutiny, it cannot be good for someone in Judith's condition. Dr. Nash has expressed real concern about her heart." "How thoughtful of Dr. Nash," I said, "to diagnose my heart without ever having taken my pulse." My own physician, Dr. Okafor, has treated me for 15 years and finds me in excellent health. But then she has only known me for 15 years, so what could she possibly understand? Preston's face darkened at that, and he leaned in close, his voice low and tense. This attitude is not helping anyone, Judith. We are trying to protect you. From what exactly, I asked, and I did not lower my voice. Financial independence, recognition for my life's work, the freedom to decide my own days. Which of those frightens you the most? Just then, Professor Lydia Kerr from Ashfield University joined our little circle, bright and eager, and began telling me how much her students would gain from studying the exhibition, and whether I might consider guest lecturing for her advanced seminar. Before I could answer, Preston stepped smoothly in. I am afraid my mother-in-law's schedule may be rather limited in the coming months, he said with a look of grave concern. Family matters, health considerations, you understand. Professor Kerr blinked confused and said she had not meant anything immediate. Even so, Preston pressed at her age with her recent episodes. We have been encouraging her to avoid stressful commitments. And I felt the old fury rise, the fury of watching a man calmly close a door in front of me as if I were not standing right there. Preston, I said loud enough for the circle to hear, I do not recall appointing you my physician or my secretary. Professor Kerr, I would be delighted to speak with your students. Let us find a date next week. The young professor beamed and said she would coordinate with the museum, and Preston's face went tight and pale because he had reached for a lever that was no longer connected to anything. Before he could recover, Frances Bellamy tapped a glass and the room quieted, and she stood in the center of the gallery and welcomed everyone and announced the partnership between the museum and, in her words, one of Harwick Cove's most distinguished artists, Judith Merrick. The applause that followed was warm and real, and I felt Sabrina go rigid at my side. Dr. Traver spoke about the exhibition, about the antique quilts from a great private collection now passing into my care, and about the new work I would create to answer them across 2 centuries. He spoke of my quilts hanging in permanent collections I had not even known had acquired them, and the revelation landed in me softly, one more stitch in the slow mending of an old wound. When he invited me to say a few words, I found I was not afraid. I thanked them, and I said that the history of this coast had always been stitched by its women in cloth and in silence, and that all I had ever tried to do was keep the thread going, and I looked out over that room, and I did not look at my daughter, and the applause when I finished was the sound of a life being handed back to me. It was afterward, as the formal part of the evening loosened into conversation, that Frances Bellamy drew me aside near a quiet case, and lowered her voice, and told me the thing that turned the whole night on its edge. Judith, she said, I need to tell you something, and I would rather you heard it from me. In the last week, a man has approached 2 dealers I know privately trying to sell a story quilt. He would not give a straight account of where it came from. He wanted cash and no questions about provenance. One of the dealers sent me a photograph because she thought it looked like important work and wanted my opinion. Frances paused. Judith, the quilt is signed in the corner. It is signed with your name. The floor did not tilt this time. It fell away entirely. Because I knew the instant she said it exactly what had happened and who the man was. When I had left Lantern Row, my own original quilts, the pieces I had kept over the years, the ones not sold to Eugenia, the private ones, the ones with my whole heart in them, had still been hanging on my walls. And in the days after, when I had asked, Preston had told me they were safe in storage. He had not put them in storage. He had been selling them quietly to whoever would take them, with no questions asked. The way you sell things when you are desperate, and you do not care what you destroy. I turned and I found Sabrina across the room, and I do not know what was on my face, but she saw it and she went pale. I crossed to her, and I did not raise my voice because the whole point of the evening had been to show that I did not need to raise my voice. Where are my quilts, Sabrina? I said. My own, the ones from my walls. Preston told me they were in storage. They are not in storage. He is selling them for cash on the street. Her mouth opened and shut. She looked for one bare second genuinely stricken. Then Preston was at her elbow, his hand closing around her arm, muttering that they were leaving, that the whole evening was a setup. And they went, the 3 of them, out through that warm, bright room full of people who had watched the entire thing, and the door closed behind them, and the balance of everything had shifted all at once to me. I did not sleep that night. I sat by the window of my suite, watching the North Beacon light sweep across the black water over and over, and I thought about a man selling my life's work for whatever he could get, and about a daughter who had stood by while he did it, and I felt the grief of it settle into my bones alongside a cold and clarifying anger. In the morning, I called Nora and told her everything, and there was a long silence on the line. And then she said in a careful voice, "This changes the picture, Judith. Taking your property and selling it without permission is theft. But there is something else I need to tell you, and I would rather you were sitting down." She had been doing her own quiet work in the weeks since I first mentioned the strange bank envelope on my kitchen table, and now the picture had come clear, and it was worse than I had let myself imagine. Preston had not simply failed in business. In the months he had lived under my roof, he had taken out a large loan against my house on Lantern Row, using my name and a forged signature, and he had done it to hold off the creditors who were closing in on him from the wreck of his firm. The bank envelope I had seen was a notice from that lender. He was being squeezed, and the whole scheme, the movers Cedar Haven, the campaign to have me declared unfit, all of it had been his desperate attempt to get full control of the house before the fraud came to light, so that he could sell it or borrow against it again and dig himself out of a hole he had dug with a shovel that had my name carved on the handle. I sat with that for a long time. It did not make me forgive him. But it did make him human to me in a way that was almost worse than hating him, because now I understood that I had not been living for 6 months with a cartoon villain. I had been living with a frightened, cornered man who had decided that the simplest way out of his own ruin was to climb out over the body of an old woman he had never once thought of as a person. And my daughter had let him. That was the part I could not get past. My daughter had let him. They made one final reckless move the kind people make when they have run out of good ones. A few days later, my bank called Nora because Sabrina had walked into a branch and presented a document that claimed to give her power of attorney over my finances on the grounds of my incapacity, built on the strength of Dr. Nash's letter, and notarized by a man who it turned out had lost his notary license 2 years earlier. The bank's fraud team flagged it in minutes and did exactly what they should have done, which was to freeze nothing of mine and call my attorney of record. Nora moved at once. She secured my accounts behind extra verification, and she filed a petition with the court for a protective order against Sabrina and Preston on the grounds of attempted financial exploitation of an older adult. And with the forged loan and the forged power of attorney and the fraudulent doctor's letter all laid out together, our footing could not have been firmer. I want to be clear about one thing because it matters, and because it is the kind of thing these stories often get wrong. I did not have the power to send anyone to prison. That is not how it works. What I could do, and what Nora did on my behalf, was report what had been done, and let the authorities and the court decide what came of it, and choose or not choose to press the matter forward. The power I held was not the power to punish. It was the power to stop being a victim and to decide on my own terms how much mercy the situation deserved. And it was that power that led me in the end to the strangest and most painful conversation of the whole affair. Because when the walls closed in on them, it was not Preston who came to me. It was Sabrina alone, sitting in the lobby of the Marlowe, one gray afternoon, her hands folded tight in her lap, waiting for me with a face I had not seen on her since she was small and had done something she could not undo. We found a quiet corner of the restaurant, and a waiter brought me tea and brought her nothing because she waved him off. "The bank called, Preston," she said without any greeting. "About the loan. About the papers I took in. They are saying words like fraud. They are saying we could be charged." "That would be accurate," I said. Her composure cracked. "You have no idea what it has been like," she said, and her voice was not the sharp voice from the front hall. It was thin and frightened. "Preston's business did not just fail, Mom. The debts are enormous. His people at the academy know something is wrong and they are circling. We were drowning. I did not know about the loan on the house. I swear to you, I did not know about that until last week. But the rest of it, the moving you out, I let myself believe it was for your own good because I could not stand to look at what it really was." She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. "I am so ashamed," she said. "I do not even have the right to say it to you. And I felt, God help me, the old pull the 40-year habit of gathering my child up when she was in pain, of making myself smaller so that she could feel better. I felt it, and for the first time in my life, I did not obey it. "Sabrina," I said, and my voice was gentle, but it did not bend. "I would have helped you. If you had come to me as my daughter honestly with respect, and simply asked, I would have moved heaven and earth for you the way I always have. Instead, you tried to erase me. You told this whole town I was losing my mind. You let your husband sell my quilts on the street for cash. That is not something a mother can pretend away over a cup of tea." She nodded, tears running now, and she did not argue, which frightened me more than any argument would have. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends on you," I said. I have filed for a protective order, and the matter of the loan and the papers is out of my hands and in the courts. But I will tell you what I told Nora. I do not want to spend the rest of my life in a courtroom fighting my own child. If you and Preston stop completely, if you cease every attempt to touch my money or my affairs or my name, and if my quilts come home all of them undamaged, then I am willing to withdraw my own complaint, and to tell the authorities I do not wish to push the matter further. I cannot promise what the court or the bank will do about the forgeries. Those are bigger than me now, but what is mine to give I will give in exchange for that. Even as I said it, my voice caught, because I did not know if the quilts could come home at all. Some of them had already gone to buyers who had asked no questions, and a quilt sold on the street to a stranger is not a thing you can simply summon back. Hundreds of hours of my life, the private pieces, the ones I had never meant to sell, might already be scattered beyond recovering. Sabrina was quiet for a long moment, looking down at her folded hands. And then she said something so unexpected that it stopped my heart. "There is one I can bring back right now," she said. She still would not look at me. "Years ago, when you were not home, I took one. I did not sell it. I hid it. It is under the floor of the cedar closet in my old room, wrapped in muslin, and it has been there the whole time. I never told Preston. I never told anyone." Which one I whispered, though I think I already knew. She looked up at me then, and her whole face was wet. "The little one," she said. "The one with the sailboat, and my name in the corner. The one you made the week I was born." I took it the year Preston and I first started struggling because I thought if things got bad enough I might have to sell it, and I could not bear the idea of you knowing. And then I could not bear the idea of selling it either. So I just kept it hidden. I would take it out sometimes at night, when everything felt like it was falling apart, and I would hold it. She pressed her hands to her face. "It is the only thing in my whole life I never let him touch. I sat there in that elegant, quiet room and I could not speak, because in the middle of all the cruelty, all the forged names and false letters and stolen work, my daughter had reached back through everything she had become and had, without knowing why, without any way to profit from it, save the one small quilt I had stitched by candlelight in the week after I brought her home from the hospital, the first thing I had ever made purely out of love and not out of need. She had hidden it under a floor and held it in the dark on the nights she was most afraid. Whatever else was true about the woman across from me, and much of it was terrible, that was also true. She had kept the thing that meant I had loved her before I had ever had reason to be disappointed in her. It did not undo what she had done. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve a fairy tale. Bringing back that one small quilt did not restore the years or return the pieces already lost or make me able to trust her again the way I once had. Some things once broken do not go back to whole, but it changed the shape of what came after. It meant that when I drew my boundary, I drew it as a woman who had been loved once by the child she raised, and not only as a woman who had been used. And that is a different thing to carry. It is lighter somehow, even when it is heavy. The weeks that followed were quieter than the ones before them, in the way that a shore is quiet after a storm has passed and left the whole beach rearranged. Preston did not fight the protective order because his lawyers told him correctly that fighting it would only draw more attention to the forgeries, which were now a matter for the authorities and no longer anything I controlled. He and Sabrina left the house on Lantern Row on the schedule the court had set in the ordinary unglamorous way that these things actually end with notices and dates, and a locksmith rather than with a shouting match at the door. I did not go to watch. Nora advised against it, and I did not want the picture of it in my head. But a neighbor told me later that on the last morning, Sabrina had stood a long while on the front walk, looking up at the stained glass over the door before she got into the car. I have thought about that more than I expected to. The girl who once pressed her nose to that glass to watch the fog turn it gold standing on the outside of it, now looking in. Whatever she was feeling in that moment, I hope some part of it was the understanding that the door had not been taken from her. She had let go of it hand over hand, one cruelty at a time, until there was nothing left to hold. Most of my private quilts I never recovered, and I have made my peace with that, or something close to peace. A few were traced through the dealers Francis knew, and quietly bought back, and each one that came home felt like a small bone knitting. And the little sailboat quilt, the one from the week Sabrina was born, came back to me wrapped in its muslin, and I did not hang it in any exhibition. I keep it folded in the cedar chest at the foot of my own bed where I can put my hand on it when the nights are long. The inheritance, when the court finally released it, arrived the way Nora and Harold Sims had always said it would, slowly and on its own schedule, many months after that first foggy morning, with no drama and no fanfare, just a set of documents and a quiet transfer and a house on the cliffs that was at last legally mine. Only then did I move out of the Marlowe and out to Eugenia's stone house above the water. I had a room built onto the back where the light comes in clean and even off the sea all day long, and I set my frame there and my threads along the shelves and the antique whaling quilts and the room full of my own work that Eugenia had loved in secret for 20 years. The museum exhibition opened the following spring, and it traveled up and down the coast, and Professor Kerr's students came, and I stood before them and spoke about the women of this shore and the stories they had stitched. And I was not a hobbyist, and I was not a burden, and I was not a confused old woman who needed to be put away. I was Judith Merrick, and I had made something that would outlast me, and everyone in that room knew it, and so did I. Sabrina and I speak now rarely and carefully, the way you handle a thing that has been mended and might still break along the old crack. She has never fully explained herself, and I have stopped needing her to. Preston is out of her life, which she says is the best thing to come out of the whole ruin, and I do not disagree. Sometimes I think there might be a real road back for the two of us, and sometimes I think there is only this, a distant and honest quiet, and I have decided that I can live with not knowing which. I left the door open. That is all a person can do. You cannot make someone walk back through it. On clear evenings, I take my tea out to the terrace of the house on the cliffs, and I watch the north beacon, light come on and begin its slow sweep across the darkening water, the way I have watched it my whole life. For most of that life, I was the lighthouse. Steady, reliable, standing in the same place for everyone else, guiding other people safely home, while the storms broke over me and no one thought to ask whether the light was tired. I gave my warmth away so freely and for so long that I forgot it was mine to begin with. It took losing my home and nearly losing my mind's good name and finding a room full of proof that I had mattered all along to learn the simplest thing there is to learn, and the hardest. You cannot pour from a lamp that no one ever fills, and it is never at any age in any fog too late to turn the light around and shine it at long last on the way back to yourself.